everyone's doing good today on this wonderful, hot summer day. Oh, here we go. Oh, first floor. Give you a little sneak peek. Looking the wrong way, the first one. It's alright. Anyways, I'll get started. But yeah, the parable of the unforgiving servant. I just want to reflect first, just like, we serve such a compassionate, merciful, loving, and forgiving God, and that's who He is. It's His character to be forgiving, to be merciful. He's not just a all-powerful, omnipresent, just, holy God, but He is also loving and forgiving. And we've sinned and we've disobeyed, and we were once separated from our Creator, but because of the sacrifice of Jesus, and we can ask for forgiveness and even submit our lives to God, and He will not only just forgive us all of our sin, but He welcomes us into His kingdom. He welcomes us into His family. We've been in the parables of Jesus this summer so far. We've heard a lot of great stories, a lot of great messages from many different people, and the past couple of weeks as I was getting ready for today to preach, I had a couple of different thoughts, and I was kind of going back and forth, like, what do I say about this? Because it's a pretty simple story. We heard Hermie the caterpillar, and now we heard Jenny share the straight from Scripture. I'm like, it's pretty straight to the point. Forgive because God's forgiven you. All right, we can go home, enjoy our AC the rest of the day. We can go home early, but there's a lot of different verses in the Bible that people have been debating for centuries. It's people written books. There's been councils and debates, and people can still disagree. But this parable is pretty simple. Forgive because you've been forgiven. So I'm like, what else do I gotta say? Jesus said everything. Just in this story. But the message of forgiveness, it may be simple, it may be a simple story, but it's not always easy, right? It's not an always easy thing to forgive someone. And just how many times this week have you had to ask someone to forgive you, right? Just ask my wife. Actually, don't ask my wife. But it's more than 7 times than Peter was suggesting. It's a very relevant thing, and we're all imperfect people. We're pursuing God. We want to become more like Christ every day, but we make mistakes. It seems like pretty much all the time, right? We're not always perfect. But what a precious opportunity it is when someone forgives us. What a beautiful picture of Jesus when someone forgives us. When I was a kid, I was about 3 years old, and my brother, I have 2 older brothers and a younger sister, but Isaac, the one who's closest in age, he was 4. We went to the basement of our house and found a big old can of paint. Popped it open and went to my mom's favorite coffee table and dumped out the whole can of paint and got creative. We were putting handprints on the furniture and on the couch, and we're just enjoying our lives. And my mom, I think she was upstairs taking care of my baby sister, and when she noticed it was a little too quiet in the house. And when you have 4 kids with a quiet house, something's usually wrong. I'm sure you guys have recently had 3 kids, and so she's like getting suspicious. She's like, all right, she calls out our names, we don't answer, so she's like, all right, what's going on? She goes to the basement, and to her horror, she sees us covered in paint ourselves, redecorating the basement, and she's like, outside now. We're like, oh, I wonder what we did wrong. And so we go outside. It's a chilly October day, and we're freezing, and my mom gets the garden hose, starts hosing us down. We're crying, not because of what we did, but because we're freezing, and she's hosing us down. And I can imagine the feelings that my mom, the thoughts that she was having. She's like, I can't believe you did this. What are you doing? And in our tears, my brother, Isaac, he looks at my mom. He's like, Mom, we forgive you. And yeah, it's true. We did forgive her for doing that to us. My mom. It took a while, but she loves that story now. But as you can imagine, I mean, as kids, we're still figuring out life. We make mistakes, but even as adults, right? We still make mistakes. But how many times, I want to ask you also this question, how many times this past week did you have to forgive someone else? Was it more than 7 times, like Peter? He had his little checklist out. He's like, all right, how many times do I got to do this? And so did you have to forgive someone else? And that's the thing, this is a really relevant story, because even to us today, if you want good relationships, if you want healthy family relationships, if you want to get along with your boss or co-workers, if you want to live a joyous life, forgiveness needs to be a big part of that, because we're all making mistakes. Even getting ready for today, I examined my own heart this week, the past 2 weeks, and I had I would say probably some prideful thoughts, thinking, I'm pretty good at forgiving people. I feel like I even ask for forgiveness when I need it. Sometimes it takes a little while, it takes a little while for me to I probably should ask for forgiveness, or I probably should. But I feel like eventually I get there. I can shrug it off. I can forgive someone. But yeah, it just kind of takes a while for me. But yeah, I was like, I'm a pretty understanding guy. But then God impressed on my heart, say, yeah, but what about when someone hurts someone that you love? That can be tough. What about someone that you care about? Someone offends them or even hurts them? It's like, can you forgive someone like that? And for me, I know, just a couple years ago, we had some friends, and a guy had done something to another friend in my heart, we weren't even that close to the situation, but even in my heart, I'm like, all right, that crossed the line. I'm just like, and I had to see him almost every day too, at the time. I'm like, I'm just gonna ignore him. I'm just gonna give him the cold shoulder. That's not cool. Even though he had asked for forgiveness from the person and started to change his life, I was like, I'm done. I'm done with you. And so that was tough for me, even when someone hurts someone that I care about. But then Capri noticed that, and she's like, why don't you forgive him? I'm like, yeah, but did you see what he did? That's not, he crossed the line. I can't forgive him for that. She's like, hasn't God forgiven you already? She asked a lot of good questions. I'm like, yes, I guess so. But the process when there's pain involved and there's hurt involved, it can't always be the easiest thing to do. But thankfully, at the time, I forgave him and moved on and tried to, begin the process of healing from that. So I want to get us into the parable again in the next slide. Is it working? No, that's fine. But we read it, verses, I'm going to start with the first couple verses. Oh, I didn't turn it on. There we go. All right, Matthew 18, 21 and 22. So this is kind of what prompts the parable from Jesus. Jesus is with his followers, and people are listening, and he's begun his ministry. And Peter, one of his closest disciples, says, Peter then came up and said to him, Lord, how often will I forgive my brother who sinned against me? Wait, how often will my brother sin against me and I forgive him? As many as 7 times? Jesus said to him, I do not say to you 7 times, but 77 times. Now there's different versions, say 77 times or 70 times 7, which I'm not a big fan of math, but it's 490. It's pretty simple. But Peter's kind of patting himself on the back. I don't know exactly what he's thinking, because at the time the common practice among the Jewish people was 3 times. They were like, someone sins against you once, twice, 3 times, you forgive them. But 4th time, all right, that's it for you. See you, cut them off, whatever you need to do. So Peter, I don't know if he's like, oh, Jesus is a pretty compassionate guy. Maybe I'll throw the number 7 out there. That might be, that's a good number, right? Maybe 7 times. And Jesus is like, no, that's not the point. 77 times, or 70 times 7. He's not giving him another number. He's not saying count up to 490 or count up to 77 times. He's saying the point is that we don't keep track. What kind of forgiveness keeps track of the number someone's wronged you? Because as humans, we can be like, all right, you wronged me once, I forgive you. Oh, that's the second time. When God, when He's forgiven us, He says, I remember this against you no longer. I don't hold this against you anymore. I've forgiven you. And so Jesus is making a point. He's saying, that's not the point of forgiveness, but you forget and you move on. There we go. So this question from Peter prompts this parable from Jesus. So read the first half, 23 through 27. It's not working. It's all right. Oh, there we go. So verses 23 through 27, it says, therefore the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his servants. When he began to settle, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. And since he could not pay, his master ordered him to be sold with his wife and his children and all that he had, and payment to be made. So the servant fell on his knees, imploring him, have patience with me, I will pay you everything. And out of pity for him, the master of that servant released him and forgave him the debt. I'll stop here right now. It's pretty clear. Now, the story is supposed to represent something. It's pretty clear to us that the king represents God, and we are put in the place of this servant in this parable. And the king is going through settling debts, settling accounts, and he comes along this servant who's owed him 10,000 talents. Now, a couple weeks ago, Pastor preached on the parable of the talents, and one talent was worth about 20 years' wages. 20 years of work for one talent. I don't know what this guy did, but 10,000 talents, more math, I know, 200,000 years of wages for this man. And he begs, he's like, I'll pay you back. There's no way he's going to pay him back. There's no possible way he's going to be able to repay this debt. But the master, out of his kindness and mercy, forgives him. Now, just kind of also to give another perspective, King Herod at the time of Jesus, his entire kingdom, the revenue was worth only 900 talents. So this servant owed over 10 times the revenue of the kingdom of Herod, and an unpayable debt, an impossible debt. And some people give, they're telling, maybe Jesus was saying this is just hyperbole, he's making a point, this is like too crazy. Or maybe he was a governor and he just squandered the king's money and used it debt. But I think this is also good representation of us. People who have disobeyed and sinned against a God who is holy, who is perfect, who is set apart, and the creator of the universe, and we broke his law. And he has every right to say, no, you broke my law. You sinned. I'm perfect. I created you, and you have disobeyed my law. So he could have just sent us off into prison, but he, out of his goodness, says, I will forgive every penny of your debt, every penny. So now you may go free with no debt at all. That is a powerful picture of forgiveness. When we got our little checklist, right, like Peter, 6, 7, done. All right, you're done. But God says, I remember this against you no longer. No more debt. Now let's read the second half of the parable. There we go. Verse 28, but when that same servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. Now a denarii was about a day's pay. So this is maybe like a few $1,000s. Definitely manageable, definitely repayable. That's not that big of a deal. But seizing him, he began to choke him, saying, pay what you owe. So his fellow servant fell down and pleaded with him the same words this other servant pleaded with the king. He says, have patience with me, and I will pay you. He refused, and went and put him in prison until he should pay the debt. Verse 31, when his fellow servants saw what had taken place, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their master all that had taken place. Then his master summoned him and said to him, you wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. And should not you have had mercy on your fellow servant, as I had mercy on you? And in anger his master delivered him to the jailers, until he should pay all his debt. So also my heavenly Father will do to every one of you, if you do not forgive your brother from the heart. That's upsetting. I mean, we can agree with those other servants who witnessed this man. He's like, man, what is that guy's problem? He had an incredible debt that he could never wish to repay. But compared to his own, this man owed him just pennies. So how could he not forgive him? We see this command given from Jesus several times through Scripture. In the Lord's Prayer, forgive us our trespasses, we forgive those who trespass against us. In Mark, he says, even when you stand and pray, if you have anything in your heart against someone, forgive him, so the Lord may forgive you. But how much do we let little things get the better of us? We may be having a bad day, I know, but sometimes, oh man, did you see what Chuck said to me last week at church? Yeah. I'm not talking to him next Sunday, even though he's got a nice shirt today. But we hold on to things, or maybe just like even someone may not even be doing something wrong. We just rubs us the wrong way. Like, oh man, I'm gonna ignore that person. I'm just gonna walk around them. But or there may be circumstances when we're like, we can't forgive that person. They haven't asked for my forgiveness in the first place. Why would I forgive them when they know they've done wrong and they aren't doing anything about it? Or maybe it's too big of a thing for me to forgive this person. This is just, they cross a line with me. I can't give them forgiveness. This reminds me of a story that Trish preached about a few months ago, Joseph. Even though he wasn't the greatest kid, saying, oh, hey, by the way, family, you guys are going to serve me one day. I mean, that's not too bad, but his own brothers sold him into slavery. His own family betrayed him. He spent years in prison dealing with betrayal. He could have just sat there in slavery and just be like, man, this stinks. He could have just held on to bitterness and resentment and hatred the rest of life. And people would have understood. We're like, yeah, your family betrayed you. That's okay. Like, we understand. But no. When a famine came later on and his family came and asked for help for food, he gave them food. He didn't say, no, go back home. I'm not giving you any food. Let your family starve to death. Remember what you did to me all those years ago? Even before they asked for forgiveness, he said, I've already forgiven you. God took what you did and meant for evil and he turned it into good. Also, it reminds me of King David, who, he killed Goliath, and King Saul welcomed him into his army. He was nothing but faithful to the king. He conquered his enemies. He was a good servant, and he played music for the king to calm him down. He did nothing. He was nothing but a good soldier and a trusted person to the king. But because of jealousy and hatred, King Saul tried to kill him. He ran him out of the country, and David was on the run with his family and for years on end, even when he knew he was anointed to be king. And when Saul was almost had caught up to David to kill him, David had a chance to take Saul's life. And even his own men, it's like, you deserve this. Take your place as king. Take his life. Look what he's done to you. This isn't fair. But Saul, or King, or David said, no, I'm not going to raise my hand against the king of Israel. No one would have blamed him if he killed Saul right then. But he forgave him, and he did not hold that against him. So forgiveness, it may be a simple idea, but it's not always easy. But Jesus is saying, you who have been forgiven much should also forgive much. And I'm not telling these different stories and giving different examples to try to guilt trip you into forgiving someone. Or saying, oh, look at, this thing was much worse than what's happened to you. Why can't you just forgive them? It's not a big deal. If this happened to someone else, you can do that with no problem. Because I don't think we should compare people's pain or compare different hurts, because I know it's a deep and personal thing. Because your pain is real, what's happened to you is real. Your experience is real, but God knows that these kinds of things can get messy. Relationships, betrayals, even accidents or misunderstandings. But Jesus is saying, he's challenging us. He's saying it is always better to forgive someone than to withhold forgiveness. We see that it wasn't the second servant who owed him just 100 denarii who ended up in a bad place. It was the unforgiving servant who ended up in a bad place. Withholding forgiveness never ends well, regardless of what the offense is. Nelson Mandela, who was he was in prison for about 27 years before he was elected president in South Africa. Now they convicted him of different crimes, but it was ultimately because he stood up for what was right, so stood up against the segregation and the law of the apartheid in South Africa, all the crimes and horrible things that were going on. And when he was freed from prison, he said, after all that, as I walked out the prison door toward the gate that would lead to my freedom, I knew if I didn't leave my bitterness and hatred behind, I would still be in prison. He also famously said, resentment is like drinking poison and hoping it kills your enemies. Unforgiveness hurts no one but the one who won't forgive. God has forgiven us all of our sin, all our debt, every sin, every penny. He's washed us completely clean. But who are we to withhold forgiveness from other broken and imperfect people that are just like us? This message is relevant just as much today as it was when Jesus preached it all those years ago. I'm sure it was challenging to the people who heard him. You imagine that even Peter, all the disciples are listening, all the crowds who had gathered around. And he says, forgive those because you've been forgiven. And as you can imagine, put yourself in the shoes of one of the people who was hearing that message. You're walking away, going home. Like, am I really supposed to do that? Was he just exaggerating? Was it just like a great story? Maybe they were still struggling with that, still thinking it over. But then not much longer after that, maybe some of those same followers were at the cross. And they look up and they see Jesus, who has been betrayed, who has been mocked and beaten, being laughed at, humiliated, and nailed to a cross. And even in that time, when Christ is taking all the pain, the sin, and the suffering, and the wrath of God on his shoulders for all mankind, even in that time, those same people hear him saying, God, forgive them. They don't know it. Even in that time for Jesus, one of the criminals who was hung on the cross next to him, who was getting what he deserved, looked at him, he says, and with a repentant heart, Jesus says, you'll be with me in my kingdom. Even during that time, Jesus found time to forgive those who were unrepentant and even those who were repentant alike. Those who have been forgiven, let us also forgive. It might be something small that you just need to be reminded to let go. But I know there are times when pain is still real and the deep feels just too deep to bear. But I want to challenge you today that even if you can't find yourself to forgive them, then just start praying for that person who's hurt you. I know when I started praying for that person who had wronged my friend who I couldn't forgive, it started to, God started to change my heart. It's like, yeah, we're all imperfect people who need a perfect God and perfect forgiveness. So I challenge you to pray for that person. And there's still healing that needs to take place, but this is the first step that we need to take, is forgiveness. Sometimes you might need to talk to someone, a friend, or a pastor, or even a professional counselor, but God is calling us to forgive one another. Now, I don't want to be too heavy, because this is a good message. This is not something we we have to forgive. I have to forgive again. This is a joyous thing because it brings healing. It brings life to us. To see someone who is repentant and to see them find God and to change, that is a glorious thing, because we were once there. We were once in a place where we needed forgiveness. So don't take this so heavy, but remember that there is joy and love in forgiveness. So I want to pray. God, we thank you for the perfect forgiveness that you've offered us. God, you washed us clean. You took away every penny of our debt, every sin, every wrongdoing, a debt that we couldn't even earn if we had lived a life of good works and giving back. God, we could have never paid it back, but God, you said, I remember this against you no longer. And so God, you are also challenging us to forgive those who have wronged us. God, forgiveness is one of the godliest things that we can do. To be Christ-like is to forgive. So God, I pray that we will take this and remember when we've been hurt or wronged, that we can say, I forgive you because Christ has forgiven me. Pray in Jesus' name.